Barron Trump gives his seat to an elderly woman. What Donald Trump says to the crowd is incredible. The air buzzed with excitement as people streamed into the massive event venue. Bright lights illuminated the stage, where large banners with Trump 2024 waved proudly. Rows upon rows of seats were packed with supporters, dressed in red, white, and blue, some waving flags, others holding signs. Chants of USA rippled through the crowd, blending with the occasional laughter of families, the hum of conversations, and the distant sound of cameras clicking. Barron Trump sat quietly in the VIP section, slightly apart from the chatter surrounding him. At 17, Barron had grown accustomed to being in the spotlight, but today he seemed more contemplative than usual. His towering frame and calm demeanor gave him an air of maturity beyond his years. Wearing a crisp suit, he sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, scanning the crowd with an expression that was both curious and reserved. His father, Donald Trump, stood backstage, preparing for yet another monumental rally. The former president was known for his electrifying presence at events like these, but even he took a moment to glance at his youngest son, seated in the front row. Barron had always been different, not one to seek attention, not one to revel in the chaos that seemed to follow their family. Donald, too, noticed this, though he seldom spoke of it aloud. It was just something about Barron, a quiet strength, a steadiness. As the crowd continued to swell, an elderly woman shuffled her way into the seating area near the back. Her silver hair was neatly combed, and she clutched a small handbag with trembling fingers. She wore a simple blue cardigan, her frail frame dwarfed by the bustling crowd around her. She looked overwhelmed as she searched for a place to sit. Every seat seemed to be taken. A young usher tried to assist her, but there was only so much they could do in the packed venue. Barron noticed her almost immediately. From his elevated position, his gaze followed her as she maneuvered slowly through the crowd. Something about her reminded him of his grandmother, or perhaps it was the way she clung to her handbag as though it contained her entire world. He couldn't quite place it, but he felt a pang of concern. The woman finally found herself at the edge of the VIP section, hesitating as she looked around. No one seemed to notice her. Most were engrossed in their own conversations or fixated on the stage. A few gave her quick glances, but no one offered her a seat. Her knees wobbled slightly, and she gripped the metal railing for support. Barron shifted in his seat, his brows knitting together. He glanced at the people seated around him, other dignitaries, political allies, and high-profile attendees, all of whom seemed oblivious to the woman's discomfort. His gaze returned to the elderly woman, who now appeared to be contemplating whether she should leave altogether. For a moment, Barron hesitated. This was his father's event, and the eyes of the world were always on him. Every move he made could be scrutinized, twisted, and amplified. He could feel the weight of the cameras that were inevitably focused on the VIP section. But something deeper stirred within him, a sense of responsibility, of decency. It wasn't a grand thought, not a calculated move. It was simple. This woman needed help, and no one else seemed to be stepping up. Slowly, Barron stood. The movement caught the attention of a few people seated nearby, who turned to look at him with mild curiosity. He didn't acknowledge them. Instead, he stepped out of the row, smoothing his suit jacket as he made his way down toward the elderly woman. His tall frame cut a striking figure as he walked, his face calm but purposeful. The woman noticed him approaching and straightened slightly, her expression a mix of surprise and apprehension. "Ma'am," Barron said softly when he reached her, his voice steady but gentle. "Are you looking for a seat?" The woman blinked up at him, her lips parting slightly as though she couldn't quite believe he was speaking to her. "Oh dear," she stammered, her voice thin and frail. I didn't realize it would be so crowded. I didn't want to cause any trouble." "You're not causing any trouble," Barron assured her with a small smile. He gestured toward the VIP section. "Please, take my seat." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." "I insist," he interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "You'll be more comfortable up front." By now, more people were beginning to notice. Murmurs rippled through the nearby sections as attendees turned their heads, trying to figure out what was happening. Barron ignored the growing attention, focusing entirely on the woman. The usher from earlier approached, their expression uncertain. "Is everything okay here?" they asked tentatively. "Yes," Barron replied simply. "I'm giving her my seat." The woman hesitated for a moment longer, clearly torn. But the kindness in Barron's expression seemed to dissolve her reluctance. With a small nod, she finally said, "Thank you. You're very kind." Barron offered his arm to help steady her as they made their way toward the VIP section. The murmurs grew louder, and a few people even began to clap softly as they realized what was happening. Donald Trump, now standing at the edge of the stage, paused in his preparations to watch his son. His expression, usually sharp and calculated, softened slightly. Once the elderly woman was seated, Barron gave her a polite nod and stepped back. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him now, but he didn't look around. Instead, he quietly moved to stand at the back of the VIP section, near the edge of the stage. He folded his hands in front of him, his expression as calm as ever. The applause grew louder, spreading through the crowd like a wave. People began to cheer, some standing to get a better look at Barron. On stage, Donald Trump adjusted his microphone and walked to the podium, clearly taking in the unexpected energy in the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming through the speakers. "Before we even get started tonight, I just have to say how proud I am of my son, Barron." The crowd erupted into cheers, their applause thunderous. Barron glanced at his father but remained composed, his face betraying only the faintest hint of a smile. Trump raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "You know, they say that actions speak louder than words," he continued, his tone a mix of humor and sincerity. And tonight, Barron's actions said it all. Kindness, respect, humility, those are the values that matter. As Trump spoke, the elderly woman turned slightly in her seat to look back at Barron, her eyes glistening with gratitude. Barron met her gaze and gave her a small nod, his calm demeanor unwavering despite the swelling attention. The energy in the room shifted. What had started as just another rally now felt different, warmer, more personal. The crowd wasn't just cheering for a political figure or a campaign. They were cheering for something much simpler, yet infinitely more powerful. A small act of kindness that reminded everyone of what truly mattered. As the applause began to settle, Donald Trump stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd with a mix of pride and reflection. His usual commanding presence softened as he gestured toward the elderly woman seated in Barron's former spot. "You know, folks," he began, his voice steady but resonant, "it's moments like these that remind us what leadership is really about. It's not just about speeches or policies, it's about the little things, the things you do when no one's looking." He paused, scanning the audience. Although, tonight, everyone was looking, and what they saw was character. Real character. The crowd erupted again, cheers echoing through the massive venue. Some attendees waved their signs in the air, while others clapped fervently, their admiration for Barron growing with each passing second. Barron, however, remained stoic at the edge of the VIP section, his tall figure standing calmly amidst the attention. He wasn't one for the spotlight, and the overwhelming reaction to his simple act of kindness was something he hadn't anticipated. But he didn't shift uncomfortably or try to deflect the attention. Instead, he simply stood there, letting the moment belong to those who needed it, the elderly woman, the crowd, and his father. Donald turned his attention back to the woman in the front row. "Ma'am," he said warmly, "you've got the best seat in the house now. And let me tell you something, it's not every day that my son gives up his seat for anyone. I've been trying to get him to switch chairs at the dinner table for years, and he hasn't budged." The audience burst into laughter, the moment lightened by Trump's signature humor. The woman smiled bashfully, her cheeks flushed as she clasped her hands together on her lap. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she called out, her voice shaking slightly but carrying through the crowd. "And thank you to your son. He's a wonderful young man." Trump's expression grew serious for a moment, and he nodded. "He really is," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Then, lifting his voice again, he addressed the crowd. "You know, I've always believed that the values we teach at home are what truly define us. And seeing Barron tonight, I can't help but feel like Melania and I did something right." The audience cheered again, their enthusiasm palpable. But amidst the roaring applause, something subtle began to shift. People in the crowd started looking around, noticing others who might need a little help or kindness. A young woman in the back row offered her water bottle to a fellow attendee who looked parched. A father with his young son stood to let an elderly couple have their seats. The ripple effect of Barron's gesture was undeniable. Back in the VIP section, a middle-aged man leaned over to Barron, his face filled with admiration. "That was a great thing you did, son," he said, patting Barron lightly on the shoulder. "You've got a good head on your shoulders." "Thank you, sir," Barron replied politely, his voice quiet but sincere. He didn't say much, but the weight of his words left an impression on those who heard him. Meanwhile, the elderly woman, now comfortably seated, looked around the venue with fresh eyes. She had attended the event hoping to feel a sense of belonging, to be a part of something bigger than herself. But she had never expected to be at the center of such an extraordinary moment. She clutched her handbag tightly, her thoughts drifting to her late husband, who had always admired acts of kindness and decency. "He would have loved this," she whispered to herself, a tear slipping down her cheek. Donald Trump continued his speech, weaving Barron's small act into the larger themes of the night. "You know, this country needs more of that. More respect for our elders, more humility, more looking out for each other," he said, his voice rising with conviction. "We've got a lot of work to do, but if we can't start with the basics, kindness, compassion, then what are we even fighting for?" The crowd roared in agreement, their applause shaking the walls of the venue. But amidst the cheers, there was a growing sense of reflection. People weren't just clapping because they were moved by Trump's words. They were clapping because they felt inspired to do better themselves. At the back of the crowd, a young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with awe, "can I give my seat to that man over there? He looks tired." His mother glanced over and saw a man standing alone, leaning heavily on a cane. She smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Of course, sweetheart," she said, helping her son to his feet. The boy ran over to the man and offered him his chair, and though the man initially protested, the boy's insistence won him over. Moments like these began to sprout throughout the venue, unnoticed by some but deeply felt by others. Barron's simple act had sparked something in the crowd, a quiet movement of kindness that rippled outward. As the night progressed, Trump's speech wove seamlessly between his usual talking points and more personal reflections. He shared stories about his upbringing, about how his parents had instilled in him a strong sense of discipline and respect. "My father was a tough man," he said, smiling faintly at the memory. "He didn't let me get away with much, and he always made sure I treated people with dignity. And my mother? She was one of the kindest souls you'd ever meet. She taught me that no matter how successful you are, you're never too good to help someone else." The audience listened intently, their cheers giving way to thoughtful silence. It wasn't often that they saw this side of Trump, the reflective, almost sentimental side. And though his usual bravado was still present, there was a sincerity in his tone that resonated deeply. Barron, standing quietly at the edge of the stage, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had always admired his father's ability to connect with people, to rally them around a cause. And tonight, in this small but meaningful moment, he felt like he was truly part of something larger. As the event began to wind down, the elderly woman stood slowly from her seat, clutching the armrest for support. She turned to Barron, who was now standing nearby, and extended her hand. "Young man," she said, her voice steady despite her frail appearance, "I don't think I've ever seen such a fine example of kindness. You've reminded me that there's still so much good in this world." Barron took her hand gently, his expression soft. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "But it was just a seat." She shook her head, smiling. "It wasn't just a seat. It was a moment that mattered." The crowd began to disperse, their spirits lifted not just by the rally but by the unexpected display of humanity that had defined the evening. People exchanged stories as they left the venue, many of them inspired to carry the night's message of kindness into their own lives. And though the lights dimmed and the stage emptied, the impact of that moment lingered. As Barron walked backstage to join his father, he caught Trump's eye. Donald placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, his expression a mix of pride and gratitude. "Good job tonight," he said simply, but the weight of those words carried everything Barron needed to hear. The crowd continued to file out of the venue, their faces alight with energy and conversation. People spoke animatedly about what they had just witnessed. Not just the speech, but the unexpected kindness that had set the tone for the entire night. The elderly woman, still seated in the VIP section, lingered for a moment as though savoring the experience. It wasn't just Barron's act of kindness or Donald Trump's words that stayed with her. It was the way the crowd had responded, how one small gesture had sparked something much larger. Barron and Donald stood backstage now, away from the noise of the dispersing crowd. The elder Trump, though usually the center of attention, appeared quieter than usual. He adjusted his tie absent-mindedly and turned to Barron, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he began, breaking the silence, "you didn't have to do that tonight." Barron looked at his father, his calm demeanor unchanged. "I know," he replied simply. "But you did." Donald let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "You know, I've seen people go through life looking for the big moments, the ones that will make headlines or turn them into heroes. But it's the little things, those quiet decisions no one asks you to make, that say the most about who you are." Barron nodded, not saying much. He wasn't one for long discussions about his actions or motivations, but his father's words meant something to him. Donald noticed the faintest hint of a smile on his son's face, and that was enough. Outside, as the crowd began to thin, reporters and photographers who had been covering the event gathered near the exits. Their focus shifted as they noticed the elderly woman stepping out of the VIP section. She walked slowly, but there was a lightness to her movements now, as though the weight of the evening had lifted her spirits. A few reporters approached her, microphones and cameras at the ready. "Ma'am, could we have a moment of your time?" one of them asked, his voice polite but eager. "We'd love to hear your thoughts on what happened tonight." She hesitated, glancing around uncertainly. She wasn't accustomed to attention like this, and the idea of being interviewed was daunting. But then she thought of Barron, of his quiet gesture, and she realized that the story might inspire others. "Well," she began, her voice steady but soft, "it was unexpected, to say the least. I came here tonight just hoping to be part of something, to feel a sense of community." And then, she paused, her eyes glistening. "Then this young man, Barron Trump, he noticed me. Out of all the people here, he saw me." The reporters leaned in, their cameras capturing every word. "And what did that mean to you?" one of them asked. The woman smiled, her expression warm. "It meant everything. In a world where people are so busy with their own lives, so focused on themselves, this young man took a moment to show kindness to someone he didn't even know. It wasn't just about giving up his seat, it was about making me feel seen, valued." Her words spread quickly. Within hours, social media platforms lit up with posts about the rally, but the focus wasn't on Donald Trump's speech. Instead, it was on Barron. Hashtags like #BarronTrumpKindness and #LeadWithCompassion trended nationwide. Photos of the moment, Barron helping the elderly woman to his seat, circulated widely, accompanied by captions praising his maturity and humility. One particularly striking image showed Barron standing at the edge of the stage after giving up his seat, his tall frame silhouetted against the bright lights, his face calm and unassuming. The image quickly became symbolic of the night's message: quiet strength, humility, and the power of small acts of kindness. Back at their residence, the Trump family gathered in the living room, the glow of the television casting soft light across the room. News anchors discussed the event in detail, their tone unusually positive. Melania Trump, seated on a plush armchair, watched with a faint smile. She turned to Barron, who sat beside her, scrolling through his phone with his usual composure. "You've made quite the impression," she said, her voice gentle but proud. Barron glanced up, his expression neutral. "It wasn't a big deal," he said. "It was to her," Melania replied, her tone firm but kind. "And now it's a big deal to a lot of people." Donald, standing near the fireplace, chuckled. "You know, Barron," he said, gesturing to the television, "most people would give their right arm for this kind of attention. And here you are, acting like it's just another day." Barron shrugged. It wasn't about the attention. Donald's laughter faded, and his expression softened. I know it wasn't. And that's why it's resonating with people. You weren't trying to make a statement, but you made one anyway. As the family continued to watch, the coverage shifted to interviews with attendees from the rally. One woman, holding her young daughter, spoke passionately about how the moment had inspired her. My little girl saw what Barron did, she said, her voice breaking slightly. And on the way home, she asked me if we could do something nice for someone tomorrow. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Teaching the next generation to be better. Another man, a veteran, shared his thoughts. It wasn't just about giving up a seat. It was a reminder that we all have a role to play in looking out for one another. No matter who you are or where you come from, kindness matters. The testimonials continued, each one adding to the growing narrative that the night had been about more than politics or speeches. It had been about humanity. In the days that followed, the story continued to gain traction. Letters began arriving at the Trump residence, many of them addressed to Barron. Some were from children, writing in crayon about how they wanted to be like him. Others were from adults, sharing personal stories about moments when someone's kindness had made a difference in their lives. Barron read each one, his expression thoughtful. One letter in particular stood out. It was from a man in his 60s, who described a time when he had been a young boy sitting alone on a bus. An older man had given up his seat to sit beside him and struck up a conversation, offering words of encouragement that the boy had never forgotten. That man probably didn't think twice about what he did, the letter read, but it stayed with me my entire life. I imagine the woman you helped will feel the same way. Barron folded the letter carefully and set it aside, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. He didn't see himself as someone extraordinary, and the idea that his small act had sparked such a response was both humbling and overwhelming. Donald noticed his son's quiet reflection and sat beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder. You know, he said, his voice softer than usual, this world can be a tough place. People don't always notice the good in others. But every now and then, someone does something that cuts through all the noise. That's what you did. Barron glanced at his father, his calm expression betraying a hint of uncertainty. I didn't do it to be noticed. And that's exactly why it's being noticed, Donald replied with a smile. You showed people something real, something they don't see enough of. That's worth something. Barron nodded slowly, his father's words sinking in. He didn't know what the future held or how this moment would shape him, but for now, he felt a quiet sense of purpose, a belief that even the smallest actions could make a difference. As the days passed, the story of Barron's simple yet profound act of kindness continued to ripple across the media and public consciousness. The elderly woman, whose name was revealed to be Eleanor Wilkins, became somewhat of an unlikely figure in the narrative. Journalists reached out to her for interviews, curious about her perspective and the impact the moment had on her life. Sitting in the cozy living room of her modest apartment, Eleanor spoke to a reporter from a local station. Her face, lined with years of experience and resilience, lit up as she recounted the moment. You know, she began, her voice calm but heartfelt, I've lived a long life, and I've seen a lot of things. But kindness like that? It's rare. Especially in someone so young. The reporter leaned forward, captivated by her words. What do you think made that moment so special? Eleanor paused, considering the question. It wasn't just about the seat, she said finally. It was about being seen, being acknowledged. We live in a world where it's so easy to feel invisible, especially as you get older. But that young man, Barron, he didn't just see me. He made me feel valued, respected. That's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Her words struck a chord, not just with the reporter but with viewers across the nation. Clips from the interview circulated widely, adding another layer of depth to the story. People began sharing their own experiences of small acts of kindness that had left lasting impressions on their lives. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #KindnessMatters and #LeadByExample, inspired by Barron's gesture. For Barron, however, life remained largely the same, or at least he tried to keep it that way. While the media frenzy swirled around him, he focused on his daily routines, attending school and spending time with his family. He wasn't one to bask in attention, and he found solace in the quieter moments of his life. One afternoon, as he sat in his room reading through some of the letters he'd received, a knock at the door broke his concentration. "Come in," he called, setting the letter aside. Melania entered, her expression soft. She held a small stack of letters in her hands. "More for you," she said, placing them on his desk. "It seems you've made quite the impression." Barron glanced at the letters and nodded. "I didn't expect all this," he admitted. "It feels strange." Melania smiled, taking a seat beside him. "Strange, perhaps. But good, no? People are inspired by what you did. You reminded them of something important." Barron looked at her, his brow furrowed slightly. "I wasn't trying to inspire anyone. I just did what felt right. And that," Melania said gently, "is why it mattered. Sometimes, the things we do without thinking, the things we do because they come from the heart, are the most powerful." Barron nodded, her words resonating with him. He picked up one of the letters and opened it, scanning the neatly written words inside. It was from a young boy named Jacob, who wrote about how he had seen the video of Barron's gesture and decided to do something similar. "I gave my lunch to a kid at school who didn't have any food," Jacob had written. "It made me feel really good, and the kid smiled a lot. I want to do more things like that." Barron smiled faintly as he read the letter. "It's amazing how something so small can mean so much to someone," he said quietly. Melania reached over and placed a hand on his arm. "That is the power of kindness, Barron. It doesn't need to be big to make a difference." Meanwhile, Donald Trump, ever the strategist, saw the narrative as an opportunity to reinforce a broader message about family values and leadership. He spoke about the moment during interviews and public appearances, using it as an example of the principles he believed in. But even as he framed it within his usual rhetoric, there was a genuine pride in his voice whenever he spoke about his son. At a televised event a week later, Donald addressed the story directly. "You know, a lot of people have been talking about what happened at the rally," he said, his tone unusually reflective. "And I've been thinking about why it struck such a chord with people. I think it's because it reminded us of something we all know deep down but sometimes forget, that it's the small things, the everyday acts of kindness, that make the biggest difference." The crowd applauded, their enthusiasm palpable. Donald smiled, raising a hand to acknowledge them before continuing. "And I have to say, seeing Barron step up like that, it reminded me of my own parents. My father always said that a real leader doesn't just talk about doing the right thing, they show it through their actions." And that's exactly what Barron did. The audience erupted into cheers, their admiration for both father and son evident. But while Donald's words resonated with many, Barron remained somewhat detached from the public spectacle. For him, the moment at the rally wasn't about leadership or making a statement, it was simply about doing what he felt was right. As more stories emerged of people inspired by the event, Barron found himself reflecting on the broader impact of his actions. One evening, he sat in the family's garden, the cool night air brushing against his face as he gazed at the stars. Donald joined him, a rare moment of quiet between father and son. "You've been thinking a lot lately," Donald said, taking a seat beside him. It wasn't a question, it was an observation. Barron nodded, his gaze still fixed on the sky. "It's strange," he said after a moment. "I didn't think something so small would become such a big deal." Donald chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "That's the thing about life, Barron. Sometimes, it's the little things that have the biggest impact. You never know how far a small act of kindness can ripple." They sat in silence for a while, the stillness of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Finally, Barron spoke again, his voice quiet but steady. "Do you think it's enough?" Donald turned to look at his son, his expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" Barron shifted slightly in his seat, his hands clasped together. "Do you think small acts of kindness are enough to make a real difference? There's so much wrong in the world, so much pain and division. It feels overwhelming." Donald sighed, his gaze drifting toward the stars. "It can feel that way," he admitted. "But here's the thing, Barron. You don't change the world all at once. You change it one moment, one person at a time. And those moments add up. They inspire others. They create a ripple effect. That's how real change starts." Barron considered his father's words, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I guess you're right," he said. Donald laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "Of course I'm right. I'm your father, remember?" Barron rolled his eyes but couldn't help but laugh as well. For all his father's bravado, there was a wisdom in his words that Barron couldn't deny. In the weeks that followed, the story of Barron's act of kindness became more than just a headline. It became a movement. Schools began incorporating lessons about the power of small acts of kindness into their curricula. Community groups organized events centered around helping others. And across the country, people shared their own stories of moments when kindness had made a difference in their lives. Barron watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of fulfillment. He didn't seek out the attention or the praise, but he appreciated knowing that something so simple had sparked something so meaningful. And as he continued with his life, he carried with him a newfound understanding of the power of kindness, not just as an idea, but as a way of being. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about the little things, seeing someone who needed help, offering a hand, and reminding them, and yourself, of the shared humanity that connects us all. Barron found himself in a unique position. Despite his quiet nature, people now regarded him as a symbol of kindness and humility. Invitations began pouring in from schools, community groups, and charitable organizations asking him to speak about the importance of small acts of kindness. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed, and he wasn't sure what he could say that hadn't already been said. After all, he hadn't done anything extraordinary, it was just a seat. But his parents, especially Melania, gently encouraged him to consider it. "It's not about the speech," she explained one evening as they sat in the kitchen, the warm glow of the chandelier casting soft light over their conversation. "It's about the message. You've inspired people, Barron, and sometimes they need to hear more. You don't have to change the world in one day. Just share your perspective." Barron listened, her words resonating with him. Slowly, he began to come around to the idea. Perhaps there was something to be gained, not just for others but for himself, in stepping outside of his comfort zone. After careful thought, he decided to accept an invitation from a local school to speak at their annual kindness assembly. The auditorium was packed when Barron arrived, his tall frame drawing curious glances from the students. They had seen the videos of him on social media, heard the stories about his gesture, and now they were eager to see the young man in person. As he walked to the stage, accompanied by polite applause, Barron felt a flicker of nervousness. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, but he reminded himself of his mother's advice. It wasn't about him, it was about the message. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. "I've been thinking a lot about what I could say to you today," he started, his voice steady but thoughtful. "When I gave up my seat at that rally, I didn't think it would turn into something so big. To me, it was just the right thing to do. But seeing how it's affected people, how it's inspired others to act with kindness, has made me realize something important. Small actions can have a big impact." The students leaned forward in their seats, captivated by his calm demeanor and earnest words. "We live in a world where it's easy to feel like what we do doesn't matter," Barron continued. "But the truth is, every choice we make, no matter how small, has the potential to make someone's day better or worse. It's up to us to decide which it will be." He paused, glancing at the rows of young faces before him. "You don't have to do something huge to make a difference. Sometimes, all it takes is noticing someone who needs help and choosing to act. That's what happened at the rally. I saw someone who needed a seat, and I gave her mine. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't hard. But it mattered to her. And because it mattered to her, it ended up mattering to a lot of other people." The students broke into applause, their enthusiasm filling the auditorium. Barron smiled faintly, a small but genuine gesture that reflected his growing confidence. He continued, sharing anecdotes from the letters he had received, stories of how others had been inspired to perform their own acts of kindness. By the time he finished, the room was buzzing with energy, the students clearly moved by his message. As Barron stepped off the stage, the school principal approached him, her expression warm and appreciative. "That was wonderful," she said, shaking his hand. "You've given these kids something to think about, and something to aspire to." "Thank you," Barron replied, his voice quiet but sincere. I'm glad I could help. Outside, a group of students gathered around him, asking questions and sharing their own stories of kindness. One girl, no older than 10, spoke shyly but with determination. I helped my neighbor carry her groceries the other day, she said. She smiled so big and it made me feel really good. Barron nodded, his expression encouraging. That's great, he said. Keep doing things like that. It makes a difference. The interaction left a lasting impression on him. For all his initial reluctance, he realized that sharing his story and hearing others was deeply fulfilling. It wasn't about being in the spotlight, it was about fostering a sense of connection, of shared humanity. And as the day went on, he began to embrace his role as a quiet ambassador for kindness. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of his gesture continued to spread. Inspired by Barron's story, several community organizations launched initiatives to promote kindness and compassion. One group started a Seats of Kindness campaign, encouraging people to give up their seats for others in public spaces like buses, trains, and waiting rooms. The campaign quickly gained traction, with people sharing their experiences on social media using the hashtag Seats of Kindness. Another organization focused on schools, creating a kindness curriculum that included activities like writing thank you notes, performing small acts of service, and recognizing classmates for their positive contributions. Teachers reported a noticeable shift in classroom dynamics, with students becoming more supportive and considerate toward one another. Back at home, Barron followed these developments with quiet interest. He was humbled by the idea that something so simple, a single moment at a rally, had sparked such widespread action. But he also remained grounded, reminding himself that the real credit belonged to the countless individuals who chose to act on the message. One evening, as he sat in the living room with his parents, flipping through news articles about the kindness movement, Donald leaned back in his chair and smiled. You know, Barron, he said, his tone lighter than usual, you might just have a brighter future in public service than any of us ever expected. Barron raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. I think I'll leave the speeches to you, Dad. Donald laughed, clapping him on the back. Fair enough. But don't sell yourself short. You've got something special, and people see that. Melania, seated nearby, chimed in. What you've done is more than just inspire people, Barron. You've reminded them of what matters most: compassion, humility, and the courage to act on what's right. Barron nodded, her words sinking in. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that this experience had changed him. It had shown him the power of small acts, the importance of paying attention to those around him, and the value of leading by example, even when no one is watching. In the weeks and months that followed, Barron continued to quietly support the kindness movement. He attended a few more events, spoke to students and community groups, and encouraged others to find their own ways to make a difference. But he never sought the spotlight, never tried to make himself the center of the story. To him, it was never about being recognized. It was about the message, and the hope that it would continue to resonate long after the cameras stopped rolling. As time went on, the story of that rally became less about Barron himself and more about the countless acts of kindness it had inspired. People across the country, and even around the world, began to see opportunities for compassion in their everyday lives, finding ways to uplift others in small but meaningful ways. And though the initial wave of attention eventually subsided, the impact of that single moment lingered, a quiet testament to the power of one simple act. Barron, for his part, returned to his life with a newfound sense of purpose. He didn't seek out grand gestures or elaborate projects. Instead, he focused on the little things, holding the door for someone, offering a kind word, and paying attention to the people around him. And in doing so, he embodied the lesson that had resonated so deeply with others, that the smallest actions, when done with genuine care, could change the world, one moment, one person at a time. Months passed since that fateful rally, but the story of Barron Trump's small act of kindness continued to reverberate across communities. The Seats of Kindness campaign had expanded beyond the United States, spreading to cities around the world. Videos of people offering their seats to elderly passengers on buses in London, subways in Tokyo, and trams in Melbourne began circulating online. The movement had transcended political affiliations and cultural differences, uniting people under the simple, universal principle of treating others with respect and dignity. Barron, however, remained largely out of the public eye. He attended school, spent time with his family, and carried on with his life in much the same way as before. Yet, something within him had changed. He found himself more attuned to the small moments around him, the quiet struggles and victories of the people he encountered. He had come to understand that the ripple effect of kindness was not a fleeting phenomenon but a continuous process, one that required attention and effort to sustain. One such moment came during a family outing to a local diner. It was a rare occasion when the Trumps could enjoy a meal out together without the pomp and spectacle of a public appearance. The diner was modest, the kind of place where the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of sizzling bacon, and the waitstaff knew the regulars by name. As Barron and his parents settled into their booth, he noticed a young waitress rushing between tables, her expression strained. She looked to be in her early 20s, her uniform slightly rumpled and her hair hastily tied back. It was clear she was overwhelmed, juggling too many orders at once while trying to maintain a polite smile. Barron watched as she approached the table next to theirs, only to have a gruff customer snap at her for forgetting his extra ketchup. The waitress apologized profusely, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment as she hurried back to the kitchen. Barron's chest tightened as he observed the interaction. He couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy for her. When she finally made her way to their table, her voice wavered slightly as she greeted them. "Hi, welcome to Joe's Diner. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Donald ordered coffee, Melania asked for tea, and Barron requested water. But before the waitress could turn to leave, Barron spoke up. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice low enough that only she could hear. The waitress blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. "Oh, I'm fine," she said quickly, her smile faltering. "Just a busy day." Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, you're doing a great job," he said sincerely. "I know it's not easy." The waitress's eyes softened, and for a moment, the tension in her posture seemed to ease. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with gratitude. "That means a lot." As she walked away, Barron's parents exchanged a glance. Melania reached over and patted his hand. "That was kind of you," she said, her voice warm. "It didn't take much," Barron replied with a small shrug. But inwardly, he felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that his words had made even a small difference in the waitress's day. When the meal was over, Donald left a generous tip, but it was Barron who wrote a short note on the back of the receipt. "You're doing great. Don't let the bad moments get to you." The waitress found the note after they had left, and though she didn't know who had written it, the words stayed with her. She kept the note in her pocket for weeks, pulling it out whenever she felt overwhelmed, a quiet reminder that someone had noticed her efforts and cared enough to acknowledge them. Stories like this became a recurring theme in Barron's life. Though he never sought recognition, his quiet acts of kindness continued to have a ripple effect. One day, as he was walking through the park near his school, he noticed a group of younger children playing soccer. One boy, smaller than the rest, was sitting on the sidelines, his arms crossed tightly over his chest and his face scrunched up in frustration. Barron approached him, crouching down to meet the boy's eye level. "Hey," he said gently. "Why aren't you playing?" The boy scowled. "They won't pass me the ball. They say I'm too slow." Barron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, when I was your age, I wasn't the fastest either," he admitted. "But you know what helped me? I just kept practicing. And I didn't let what other people said stop me from trying." The boy looked up at him, his scowl softening. "Really? Really?" Barron said with a small smile. "How about I play with you for a bit? We'll show them what you've got." The boy's face lit up, and he nodded eagerly. For the next 20 minutes, Barron kicked the ball back and forth with the boy, offering encouragement and tips along the way. By the time they finished, the boy's confidence had grown, and he rejoined the game with newfound determination. As Barron walked away, he glanced back to see the boy scoring a goal, his face beaming with pride. It was a small moment, but it reminded Barron of the power of simply paying attention, of seeing someone who felt unseen and choosing to lift them up. Meanwhile, the Seats of Kindness campaign continued to thrive. Inspired by its success, community leaders launched additional initiatives to promote compassion and empathy. Schools organized kindness challenges, encouraging students to perform at least one act of kindness each day. Local businesses partnered with nonprofits to create programs that supported vulnerable populations, from providing meals to homeless shelters to offering job training for those in need. The media occasionally revisited the story of Barron's gesture, highlighting how it had grown into a global movement. But Barron himself remained humble, deflecting attention whenever possible. To him, it was never about being a symbol or a role model. It was about living out the values his parents had instilled in him and encouraging others to do the same. One evening, as the family gathered in their living room, Donald turned to Barron with a rare look of seriousness. "You know, son," he said, his voice steady, "I've been in the spotlight my whole life. I've seen how fame and power can change people, how it can make them forget what really matters. But you've managed to stay grounded. You've shown people that real strength comes from humility, from kindness. And I couldn't be prouder of you." Barron glanced at his father, his expression thoughtful. "Thanks, Dad," he said simply. Melania smiled, her gaze soft. "He's right, Barron. You've done something remarkable, not just in what you've inspired, but in how you've carried yourself through it all." As the family sat together, the glow of the fireplace casting warm light across the room, Barron felt a deep sense of gratitude. He didn't see himself as extraordinary, but he was beginning to understand that it wasn't about being extraordinary, it was about choosing to make a difference, no matter how small. In the years that followed, Barron continued to quietly live out the values that had come to define him. He pursued his own path, guided by the lessons he had learned from that single moment of kindness at the rally. And though the world around him often felt chaotic and uncertain, he held on to the belief that even the smallest acts could create ripples of change. Because in the end, it wasn't about being in the spotlight or making headlines. It was about the quiet power of kindness, the kind that could inspire a movement, lift someone's spirits, or simply remind people of their shared humanity. And that, Barron knew, was more than enough.